Hello and welcome to a Monster Mechanics mini episode where we're going to talk about Planescape.
So Planescape has always had a very special place in my heart. It was kind of one of those D&D settings that I never actually really got to experience in game format.
Oh, yeah.
But I love all the source material for it. I initially found it because of the main artist for it, Tony DiTerlizzi. I remembered seeing his art in the Monstrous Manuals for 2nd edition, and then I found a whole campaign setting where he had done most of the illustration for it, and I fell in love with the art style and then the writing and just the theme of the whole thing. So for those who don't know, Planescape is sort of taking an idea that's touched on in the D&D setting, which is the idea of multiple planes of existence. Usually they're sort of themed or whatnot. Like you have the elemental plane of fire or the abyss, which is sort of Hell version 2.0. And it kind of ties all these different disparate planes of existence together around what is probably the most interesting aspect of Planescape, the City of Doors, or Sigil. And Sigil is sort of this nexus point or melting pot of all the different planes. So you have creatures from the heavens or from the elemental planes. All of them can arrive at this sort of meeting place. One of the interesting things about it is in D&D, the idea of gods is very much a given. You have the gods, evil gods, good gods, all of that. And there's all of these here, and they're very much a given in that they interact with the world through their priests and clerics and whatnot. But here at the center of the multiverse, in the City of Doors in Sigil, they are expressly forbidden from being, and they are kept out by this sort of gatekeeper and guardian and governess of the city known as the Lady of Pain, which, if you're at all familiar with the Planescape setting, her face is on all their products. Kind of the mascot for the Planescape setting.
Yeah. And so the difference between the Planescape setting and especially Sigil itself, which I think if you're going to talk about Planescape, I mean, you're going to spend a lot of time talking about Sigil. Mm-hmm. But one of the big differences is the difference between sort of rural fantasy, like the sort of the fantasy of the wilderness and the wild, mm-hmm. and the urban fantasy, the metropolis of Sigil. And the flavor is completely different. So much so that the game starts to sort of break down a little bit in Sigil to me.
Because the city is so rich in that kind of urban flavor. Yeah, a lot of the traditional D&D tropes don't really work so well here. In fact, Planescape and Sigil especially feels a lot more almost sci-fi than traditional fantasy, which is another reason why I'm so drawn to it. I love kind of those Nexus City style things like Mass Effect with their Citadel, or other analogies are eluding me, but it's kind of like the New York of the
multiverse.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's like it reminds me of sort of Ankh-Morpork from Terry Pratchett, or mm-hmm. Yeah, for that matter, even Waterdeep has some sort of that same sort of urbanish feel where you look in every direction and you'll see city instead of, mm-hmm. ruins or trees or desert or something like that. And where the life of the city is in its people and the people around you. Mm-hmm. Oh, what's the city from Mistborn? Yeah. It's the one where all of the first book takes place.
Yeah, I'm blanking on the name, but I know what you're talking
Luthadel.
About. Yes.
Luthadel. Yeah, which is the same sort of thing where it's the city for the whole surrounding realm, and mm-hmm. you have this entire story that takes place within its confines.
And I think because they spent so much time focusing on the City of Doors Sigil, that's why it feels so alive, especially compared to sort of the nebulousness of the planes that it interconnects. It feels like this hotspot of life and vibrancy, especially because it works as a focus for all these planes, because you can kind of pull bits and elements into them, and they can all coexist within the city. In fact, they have to.
As a storytelling device, Sigil is really useful because you can realistically pull anything. You could be like, mm-hmm. there's a door from Sigil to somewhere, any multiverse you can think of. And so if you as a GM, or if you're working more something like an author, if you're like, I need a giant fireman for this next thing, you're like, well, I'll just pull it. This guy is probably a baker in his day job on Sigil. It's their weirdness is super normal on Sigil, which is a really cool concept. I super dig it as well.
And just functions really well as the nexus point for a lot of great storytelling elements. Like if you want to do sort of like the anime isekai style, fish out of water, like I'm just some guy who's now thrust into this weird universe. This is a great module for doing that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I have to second a big part of that appeal is the original art from that book is super good, and then a whole big section of it, this is just praising the craft of having created that original book. I love that huge sections of it are done in character guides where like the I don't remember if they've named the character or not, but it's a person talking to you, and they use a bunch of Cockney rhyming slang and stuff. For example, Burke is used a ton in Planescape, and it was only years later that I realized that that's Cockney rhyming slang. It comes from Berkeley Hunt, and it means which is like that is a getting stuff past the radar that I am totally for.
But yeah, they absolutely run with that slang and whatnot, and it just the way that it's always addressing the reader rather than just being a passive treatise on whatever you're reading about is really cool. It kind of pulls you in and makes you feel like you're a part of this universe, even if you're just, show a passing interest in it.
Yeah. That's definitely a source book that you can get a huge amount of enjoyment out of just like reading your way through those original Planescape source books without ever actually playing in it. Because you and I have played a lot of D&D together, and I don't think we've ever actually been to Sigil, even though we've pulled a ton of stuff from it.
We haven't, and it's one of those things where I've always wanted to, but it's such a daunting task because it's so difficult to present all these ideas all at once. So it kind of works really well for like a fish out of water, like a visit, or just like being a tangential part of it, of your campaign. But to get everybody kind of immersed in it from the get-go, that's kind of a tall order because everyone needs to sort of know the source material, especially because one of the driving aspects of this is that is the factions, which I don't think we've really even talked about at all. But it's one of the main driving things is these factions, which are like they're sort of these.
They're the main political powers within the city.
Yeah, they're the political powers, but they're also, rather than being just government, they are isms taken to their natural extremes.
They're groups of people that instead of being bound together by like a common heritage, they're all bound together by a common philosophy, which is a really great way to give that melting pot, to integrate that melting pot favor of Sigil into something like a political faction.
Especially in a setting where, because you have access to everything, and they sort of ignore that in favor of these philosophical musings like, what does it mean to be the center of the universe in a multiverse? Things like that. And I think it's such a cool idea that adds so much life to something that could have fallen really flat because you're trying to touch on so many things.
Yeah. It's a fantastic setting. I think that one of the reasons why it is so hard, at least we found it so hard to play Dungeons and Dragons in Sigil, is that Dungeons and Dragons isn't an urban game. The game cycle of that particular property is built around, you start in a base of operation, you go out into the wilderness, into the unknown, where everything is a threat. You explore, you find some new cool things, you fight some dudes, you acquire some treasure, and then you return to your base of operation usually, or some other different base of operation. You go back to civilization. And it's like there's whole big sections of the game where they assume that you can just attack people, basically, as part of the game is to go out and fight. That doesn't work in an urban setting in the same way, where you're not going to go to a baker's shop and kill anybody and get their loot. You have to go and negotiate with them. And the social skills and interactions within D&D are just not well fleshed out.
Especially in the earlier editions. I feel like they've systemized that a little better with 5th edition, but it's still definitely one of the weaker aspects of D&D.
I will admit the DM's tools, or the Dungeon Master tools for like creating stuff, is not as robust, especially for something like Sigil, where instead of like being able to grab things really easily and pull them in and explain them, you have to sort of stat stuff out. You have to have it prepped ahead of time. There's a real, in D&D especially, there's a real expectation for the Dungeon Master to create everything and then just present it to the to the players. In other systems where it's more collaborative, you can expect if your thief says, "Hey, I need to go talk to somebody," you could expect the GM to say, "Okay, who can you talk to?" and just let's create this together. And D&D doesn't foster that. Now, since we've spent a whole 15 minutes talking about how good the setting is, it has inspired the creation of other RPGs and games that have that actually I think tell these stories pretty well. So I'm gonna mention a couple of them. People who are familiar with them are probably yelling at their phone by now. Blades in the Dark is got a ton of the same tone and flavor, and it's meant specifically to run in an urban setting, and it's basically about running jobs.
Interesting.
Also, as much as I love Sigil, the world of Blades in the Dark is wild. It's a world where the sun died and everything is dark now, and like when you see stars in the sky, they always change, but the stars that you see reflected in the ocean never do. And like there's bad stuff going on down in the ocean, and ghosts are real, and like you can see the fragments of the sun in the sky sometimes. It's wild. It's really good.
That's badass. I'm gonna have to check that out.
Yeah. So Blades in the Dark. There's also Spire, which is similarly that's got more fantastical architecture. It's all about living in this giant tower where weird stuff is all of the time, and it's got that same thing. Like both of those source books, I know those guys read the Planescape source books before they went back, and they, instead of trying to tack them onto a built-up RPG system, they built systems or adapted other ones to tell stories in that style. Really good. Would definitely recommend them.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to tackle the Planescape setting, is divorce it a bit from D&D and come at it from a system that encourages urban exploration and dealing with these kind of bizarre characters where you can expect to talk to angels and demons coexisting as neighbors.
Yeah, and you can expect all kinds of weird stuff, and you can justify it, which is really nice to say, "Oh yeah, well this came from somewhere else. It's weird." You're being in a world where you can't expect to understand everything can be super interesting for stories, just because it's too big and too weird. And I'm a sucker for multiverse stuff. I love anything where it could be different planes of existence and stuff. I think we have maybe just enough time to do a little bit of story time, because we never played in Sigil, but we drew heavily from it for a couple of our things.
Absolutely.
Specifically, back when we were so deep into Advanced Dungeons and Dragons second edition that then I customized the entire rule set for us to play in our own way.
Mm-hmm.
We ran I think it was a 2 or 3 year campaign in that, which was mostly just you, myself as GM, and the woman who is now my wife as our third player or our second player. And your main character was from Sigil, which was fun.
This was sort of my first time playing a tiefling, and who are just a race I love, and mostly because of the weirdness of Planescape. They've since been sort of dumbed down to a standardized.
That is the biggest thing that came out of Planescape, though, is like the tiefling is a common race now, like, which is to say that everybody knows them, but like they came out of that world where people were expecting to crossbreed with demons and stuff, and you would just have people that had weird features.
Yeah, but yeah, such a good campaign. Definitely one of my favorite campaigns that we've run, playing as a tourist from Sigil.
I love that bit as a character who is literally just wandering around having adventures because they think it's a good idea. That's a classic D&D character to me.
Just visiting the prime material plane because, hey, looks good in the brochure.
And then the one feature that I love, that I would love to go back to in some sort of way, is Gate Ball, which we made up for. Or what, did we make it up, or did we steal it from something?
Oh, I feel like
I remember. It's mentioned offhand in Baldur's Gate 2 by an NPC.
Is it?
I'm pretty sure that, like, I think they mention it offhand.
I believe it, but yeah, we definitely ran with that.
Oh yeah, we were like, there was an NPC who was he was a party member for a real long time, who was a Gate Ball player, and we had the whole idea of like playing a game that itself traveled through multiple dimensions was super fun to us.
I think a lot of my inspiration came from things like Blood Bowl and whatnot, where it's just a highly lethal sport that sort of takes place throughout the various planes and whatnot.
Yeah, it was a little bit Calvin Ball, where you could just make up. The audience and us as the writers were never supposed to know the rules, but all of the characters in the universe do. Love it.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, I think we've got a whole rundown of one of you and I's favorite setting. I'll admit I like Spelljammer just a little bit more than Planescape, but we can talk about that one another time. But like right at the top tier, I mean, this is better than Faerun and Ravenscroft, or I forget the other ones.
Ravenloft.
Ravenloft. Yeah. Anyway. All right. Well, I think that'll be it for us then.
Yeah. Until next time.
All right. Bye. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Monster Mechanics. Hey, did you know we had a Patreon? It's at patreon.com/monsterpod. I have recently added a new tier, which is if you join at the $6 a month or more tier, then at our next random monster mini episode, myself and Zach will name one of our random monsters after you. Now to the credits. Monster Mechanics is produced and edited by me, Scott Paladin, and hosted by myself and my best friend, Zach Jaquays. All of the ideas generated during this podcast are released under a do what the f*** you want public license.